1999 was a depressing time for Sega Saturn owners. The year prior marked an end of support for the platform in the West, and now that the Dreamcast was out in Japan, Saturn releases began slowing to a trickle. We did get the classics Street Fighter 03 and Dungeons & Dragons collection, but outside of that there wasn't much interesting to a gamer like me. Despite a strong showing in the first few years, even the Saturn empire in Japan was crumbling into ruin. As the year 2000 came into focus, the final Saturn titles the retail market would ever see were released. Among those final few was Capcom's Final Fight Revenge. This was based on an arcade game released in 1999 for the ST-V Titan board, the coin-op version of the Saturn home hardware. It was only released in Japan and it came and went with virtually no coverage in the Western magazines. I knew of it but didn't really know anything about it. That was until the gaming media picked up the Saturn home release in March of 2000. Reviews came in swift and without mercy. Editors claimed it was one of the worst fighting games ever released for any platform. They bashed everything about it. The visuals, the gameplay, you name it, and they crushed it under a mountain of criticism. As the years went on, its reputation got worse. Websites, blogs, videos, and all other manner of content towed the line that Final Fight Revenge was simply just that bad. But was all this just hyperbole because everyone had simply wanted a two-dimensional Final Fight beat-em-up and not a 3D fighting game to end the life of the Saturn? In this episode, we are going to take a look at Final Fight Revenge, talk a bit about how it looks and plays, and answer that question, is it truly as bad as everyone says? Final Fight Revenge was developed by Capcom USA, based on the designs of Capcom in Japan. It requires the use of the 4MB extended RAM cartridge and came in both a standalone release and one packed with the cart. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 3D one-on-one fighter similar to something like Tekken, but the gameplay is strictly Street Fighter in nature. Set in the Final Fight universe, you'll find a slew of familiar faces. There are the three main heroes, Cody, Guy, and Hagar, as well as a bunch of bad guys like Andore and Poison. Some are small and fast, while the bigger fighters like Hugo and Eddie E rely heavily on grappling and projectile moves. Gameplay has 4 main attack buttons, 2 for a weak punch and kick, and 2 for a strong punch and kick. There is also one special dodge button that is also used to pick up weapons, and a taunt if that's your sort of thing. Special moves are typically done in quarter, half, and full circle directional pad motions, and there are supers similar to Street Fighter as well. Since this is based on Final Fight, Capcom made weapons a big part of the gameplay. At the start of every match, there are weapons on the ground you can pick up and use at will. Some of these weapons have a special connection to the fighter, where they will have a move that uses it specifically. These weapon choices are composed of both melee and projectile-based attacks. Throws are also a huge part of the gameplay, usually being as simple to perform as pressing a direction and an attack button. Ground throws, air throws, and even special and super throws show up frequently. There are normal and turbo gameplay options, as well as an auto guard for beginners. Game modes are fairly limited from there. There is an arcade mode that gives you a boss to fight at the end, and a small story clip to explain what the fighter does after his victory. Then there's a no-frills 2-player versus mode to round out the limited options.
Sweet! KO!
Final Fight Revenge isn't a bad looking game. It's bright, colorful, and thanks to that 4MB RAM cart, there's tons of moves, special finishers, and the load times that zip past fairly quickly. The fighters themselves look good for a game of this era, though the bigger, more chunkier guys do have a more angular aesthetic that doesn't hold up as well. The stages make heavy use of VDP2 or the Saturn's background graphics chip. This gives you a floor that moves smoothly and multi-layer backgrounds that have lots of detail. Weapons are completely made of polygons and lay strewn on the arena's floor. The super attacks are fairly flashy, usually involving multiple combo hits like Street Fighter, but this takes things a bit further by being cinematic as well. Some fighters have supers that switch the perspective entirely. For instance, Eddie E will jump in his police car and run you down. Guy launches throwing knives at you, and El Gato goes into an X-ray mode where he snaps your bones. Some of these are pretty entertaining, and if your final blow should kill your opponent, there is often an extra bit of animation showing you finishing the opponent. For all intents and purposes, you can find much worse looking 3D fighters on the Saturn. It's no Virtua Fighter 2 or Dead or Alive, but at a time when we had the likes of Criticom and FIST, you can't be but so hard on it.
No!
You're already dead.
Cody wins!
The sound and music of this one is another area where I didn't really find many problems. There's lots of voice samples, and while none of the soundtrack is top tier, the laid-back Street Fighter Alpha 1 nature isn't completely unwelcome. It's serviceable and gets the job done. With the sound and visuals holding enough appeal to build a game around, it's the gameplay that comes into focus for this critique. The reputation that it plays terribly is not completely unfounded. The AI is aggressively cheap even on the easiest setting. It blocks most everything, throws you at every chance, and spams weapons to the point of frustration. This means getting a grip can take some time while you adjust your strategies to win. And when you do, the facade that made the AI seem unbreakable soon melts away and reveals it to be extremely limited. While it'll block your supers constantly, it falls for simple stuff like low attacks and 1-2 combos nearly every time. That makes for a one-player mode with not a lot of replay value. Once you find what the CPU falls for, the fun factor plummets. Weapons are also another area that was done poorly. While there are a pretty fair number of them, they are difficult to pick up while you're actually fighting. You have to be standing right over the weapon, and there needs to be a green arrow saying you can pick it up. Hitting the button to pick it up also leaves you open to the aggressive AI, which usually leads to taking a throw, special, or super attack. As far as story content, there's nothing except for the endings. There's no opening cinematic, no mid-fight cinematics, and no setup introducing its zombified final boss. All you get is a quick word or two when you beat it, which still explains nothing of why anyone was there in the first place. But for all its issues, it's still completely playable. Your initial curiosity will have you playing around with the weapons, specials, and supers, which can occupy you for a few days. The variety in fighters is also nice. Each one is loaded with little touches that again will keep you messing with each one for a while until you see what they're capable of. The long-term fun factor certainly takes a hit the more you play, but this idea that this is the worst fighter ever, heck, even the worst fighter on the Saturn, is absolute nonsense.
Don't move!
Oh! Poison wins!
Piece of cake!
I believe that Final Fight Revenge is both a victim of expectation and the competition of its era. To put it plainly, when most folks thought of Final Fight, they thought of that classic beat 'em up that came out in the arcade. They wanted more of that on the Saturn, where two-dimensional games were typically well made and still looked incredible. Coming face to face with the reality of this being a 3D fighter was a massive disappointment that immediately set it up for a letdown. But Revenge here was also a failure of its own design. While I can tell you it's playable enough, there's no question that by the year 2000, there simply was no room for a 3D fighter that was just okay. By 2000, we had Tekken 3, Soul Calibur, Fighters Megamix, and countless others from Capcom themselves that screamed quality. To settle for this was like owning a Lamborghini and then taking a Pinto for a test drive. There just wasn't a point. The genre was filled with choice already, and with the Dreamcast piling up fighters one after the other, who the hell had time to play a so-so entry like this? And that story pretty much tells us all we need to know today. With so many good fighters on Saturn, why bother with one that has so many issues, particularly its longevity? Since most of us are older and have limited time to devote to games these days, you might get a kick out of this for a day or two, but expecting anything more will lead most of you to a disappointing end. Final Fight Revenge may not be the worst game on the Saturn, but it also has enough issues to set it far back from a must-play. And if you still only play real game discs on real hardware, I wouldn't go near this one unless you are independently wealthy. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.